Most of the population of Western Australia lives here on the Perth coastal plain. I'm standing in part of the original bushland that remains at Jandakot, an outer suburb of Perth. On my right is Jandakot Airport, headquarters of the famous Flying Doctor Service, and on my left is the advancing urban sprawl. I spent my youth just a few kilometres from here. My introduction to nature study began with the building of cubby houses in the nearby bush. However, it was only when I began to study the local vegetation as a student that I gradually realised the wonderful and varied ways of nature in solving the problems of survival. In fact, this is an excellent example of a finely balanced ecosystem in which all the organisms are dependent on each other. Ecologists call this type of vegetation Banksia woodland. Woodland because of the abundance of moderate-sized trees whose canopies do not form dense shade, and Banksia because the vegetation is dominated by species of Banksia. The Banksia woodland is located on the deep acid sands of the Perth coastal plain. Dune vegetation and eucalypt woodland to the west are a feature of the alkaline sands fronting the Indian Ocean. Swamp vegetation and eucalypt woodlands to the east are the characteristic vegetation of the heavier soils at the base of the Darling Ranges. The ranges themselves are covered with valley vegetation and eucalypt forest. These four parallel zones of vegetation extend well to the north and south of Perth, and Jandakot, just outside the metropolitan boundary of Perth, lies in the middle of the Banksia woodland zone. There are 5 species of Banksia in the buffer zone around Jandakot Airport. The most abundant and the best known is the firewood Banksia, Banksia menziesii, whose blooms are among the most beautiful of all Banksias. The flower buds are a deep pink with a striking silver edge and are aligned in vertical rows. The mature flowers are orange, tipped with yellow. Humans aren't the only ones who find its blooms attractive. The stick-nest ant Chromatogaster conifer likes the nectar of Banksias, and it is not at all keen to share its meal with other animals, or a careless hand for that matter. The ants spend their time at the base of the flowers where the nectaries are located, whereas the pollen and receptive stigma are at the tip of the flowers. This means the ants cannot get at the pollen and are only robbers, not pollinators. The real pollinators are nectar-feeding birds. Banksia menziesii flowers in early winter. This Banksia is always found together with the candlestick Banksia, Banksia attenuata. This species produces bright yellow candlesticks over summer when other Banksias have stopped flowering. The candlestick Banksia has much thinner leaves than the firewood Banksia, and its shinier leaves reflect light and heat, which might otherwise scorch the leaves during the hot, dry summer. The third species is the bull Banksia, Banksia grandis. This is one of the tallest of the 72 species in the Banksia genus, reaching a height of 15 metres. It has very large leaves which are popular in dried flower arrangements, with the serrations running right to the midrib of the leaf. The bull Banksia flowers in late spring to early summer, and its grey blooms, which turn yellow on opening, are the grandest of them all, reaching a length of 30 centimetres. A species looking very much like the candlestick Banksia is the swamp Banksia, Banksia littoralis. However, its spring blooms are not held above the canopy like the other Banksias, but instead are hidden inside the canopy. This, however, does not stop birds from seeking them out for their nectar. Another distinctive feature of the swamp Banksia is the white, velvety underside of the otherwise dark green leaves. The final major species of Banksia on the Perth coastal plain is this rather tall, holly-leaved Banksia, Banksia elicifolia. Now, this species flowers in spring and occurs on quite moist but not waterlogged soils. As its name suggests, Banksia elicifolia has holly-shaped leaves with spiny edges. It is not obviously a Banksia, as it is covered in quite small clusters of flowers, rather reminiscent of the closely related genus Dryandra. However, like all true Banksias, elicifolia has a short woody spike which bears the flowers. And between these flowers are woolly bracts which are always present in the genus Banksia. Most plants on the Perth coastal plain occur here on the old, dry, deep sands of the dune systems. However, in the pockets between the systems, we find quite a different habitat created. When we see the soils, we notice that they have mosses on them, indicating that the soils are much moister here, and there's a high level of humus in them as well, and they have a clay subsoil. This creates quite a different habitat. The vegetation is quite distinctive as well, and quite different species are found here. For example, this Melaleuca priceana. This is Melaleuca priceana. Note the fine, wiry leaves on the twisting branches, blackened by a recent bushfire. In fact, Melaleuca means black and white in reference to the colour of the powdery bark. In fact, this paper bark, as it's known, serves to protect the plant from fire and heat. But also, it contains large air spaces between the many layers of fine corky tissue. And this provides an air passage down to the roots and enables oxygen to reach the roots even under waterlogged conditions. Melaleuca priceana bears masses of white bottle-brush flowers in early summer. These are pollinated by many types of insects, especially wasps. The pattern of vegetation changes across the old dune system. Banksia woodland occurs on the deep sands. Melaleuca priceana grows in the moister pockets between the dunes. The peaty swamp areas with clay in the subsoil support sedges and wire rushes. Banksia littoralis occurs around the edges of the swamps. Banksia elicifolia and Banksia grandis grow on the slopes of the dune system. And Banksia menziesii and Banksia attenuata occur on the driest slopes and crests of the dunes. One plant which is not so particular about soil type is the famous West Australian Christmas tree, Nutsia floribunda. In November, it transforms from a uniform grey-green canopy bearing inconspicuous buds into masses of brilliant orange flowers which cascade over the plant to reveal one of the world's most spectacular flowering trees. It is pollinated by insects, many of which have been displaced in Banksia woodland by the introduced honeybee, which is very efficient at removing the nectar and pollen. The flowers occur in threes, only one of which has a fertile ovary. This means only one winged fruit develops in each cup, held in place by 3 bracts between the 3 wings, until dislodged and dispersed by a strong gust of wind. The range of trees is more than matched by the wealth of the ground flora. Most shrubs and herbs in Banksia woodland flower in spring, when the bright gold of the common native buttercup, Herbertia hypericoides, is a delight. The prickly Moses, Acacia pulchella, is only conspicuous, and painfully so because of its spines, for a few years after a bushfire. Its hard seed, however, can remain dormant for many years until germination is stimulated by the next fire. A much rarer spiny individual is this charming purple pea, Hovia pungens. All plants which reflect strongly in the ultraviolet range like this one are insect pollinated. Greatly admired are the ground orchids, which are the sort of thing you stumble across rather than find. And the best known is this cowslip orchid, Caladinia flava. Note how the darker lines on the petals and sepals should serve to direct the insect towards the central column where the pollen mass and stigma are located. The peaty swamps have their own array of shrubs among the sedges, including this black-eyed Susan, Tetratheca verticillata, whose flowers hang upside down, and the showy pink Boronia, fastigiata, which is one of the few flowers here with a perfume. Back in the woodland we find the rather dainty common bandgene Pimelia rosea, with its rose-pink flowers in tight clusters supported by bracts. The individual flowers mature in two phases. The anthers ripen first and are held by the filaments directly above the entrance to the flower. When the pollen has been spent, the anthers are shifted to the side and the ripe stigma is now pushed above the entrance. This phenomenon of the pollen maturing before the stigma is called protandry and is widespread in the flora. From a longitudinal section, it is clear that when a pollinator probes the young flower, it meets pollen-covered anthers first. It carries this pollen away to another flower. When the insect probes the mature flower, it meets the stigma first, and this time the insect deposits its pollen load, which increases the chances of cross-pollination between different plants. One of the most exciting species to find are the trigger plants. When not in flower, they are inconspicuous herbs. This is one of the largest flowered trigger plants, Stylidium schunoides. Its delicate form masks the surprise it has in store for an insect visitor. A section through the flower shows there is a column or trigger bent back behind the petals. When a wasp or fly touches the base of the flower while seeking nectar, it sends an electrochemical stimulus up the column. On reaching the bend, the stimulus causes the lower cells to elongate suddenly, and the column flips over in 1/500th of a second. Let's look at it again from a different angle. The head of the column hits the insect's body, sometimes stunning it. The trigger takes a few minutes to recover its original position, ready to be fired again. What's the function of this elaborate mechanism? In the young flower, the head bears two pairs of anthers, which shed their pollen when they hit the insect. In the mature flower, the empty anthers are pushed to the side, and the receptive stigma emerges. Now, when the column hits an insect, it picks up pollen carried on its back. Another example of increased outcrossing through protandry. Let us return to one of the Banksias which has a particularly fascinating reproductive system, the holly-leaved Banksia. The flower heads first appear as a cluster of green buds which gradually turn yellow as they mature. They do not remain yellow for long, changing from pink and then to deep red in a few days. The old flowers begin to fade and finally drop off. Many of the heads do not produce any seed, but in others young follicles develop, each containing two winged seeds. When we do a count on the number of heads on a tree, we find 30% are yellow, 10% are pink, and 60% are red. But which colours do the pollinators visit? The most important visitors are honey-eaters, which are seeking nectar, while other visitors include beetles and wasps, which are seeking pollen. If we watch carefully, we find that the birds and insects almost always visit the yellowheads and ignore the pink and red ones. Here, for example, are the results for 3 bird pollinators and a wasp. We see that the pollinators only visit the yellow flowers and not the red ones. Why should this be so? We can insert a fine capillary tube into the flowers and find that only the yellow ones have any nectar. We place the nectar onto the prism of a refractometer, which has been calibrated to determine the sugar content of liquids. Further, only the yellow flowers have their tips consistently covered in pollen. Apart from differences in nectar and pollen, only the yellow flowers have a strong, musty odour, while the red ones are no longer receptive and have already been fertilised. So it would seem turning red is a signal to the pollinators that a nectar or pollen reward is no longer present, and visiting the flower would be a waste of time. By only visiting the yellow flowers, the pollinator always receives a reward, and pollen transfer is assured. This is much more efficient than if there was no colour change and the pollinator had to visit all the flowers whether pollen was present or not. While there is great variation between species, the variation within a species should also be recognised. For example, take this native iris, Patersonia occidentalis, which is normally violet. Within this part of the Banksia woodland, which is to be developed as a shopping centre, here we have a pure white form, completely unknown in cultivation. Apart from clearing the vegetation for the purposes of accommodating people, the second major threat to the Banksia woodland are weeds. Almost all the weeds here are herbaceous plants which die down over the summer. Perhaps the most aggressive and notorious of these is this South African veldtgrass, Ehrhata calycina. It reproduces vigorously by seed, and also its clumps increase in size year by year. It flowers early in the growing season and smothers the native plants as they in turn come into flower later on. For example, take this yellow Calytrix flavescens, which is struggling to flower at the moment through a dense canopy of South African veldtgrass. In fact, most of the weeds have their origins in South Africa and to a lesser extent the Mediterranean. They include such species as the wild oats, wild gladiolus, watsonia, the blowfly grass and the yellow form of the pigface Carpobrotus. The size of the trees and the wealth of the flora in this environment is quite amazing when you think that there's effectively no rain between November and April each year, with temperatures rising often over 40 degrees centigrade. In addition, we're standing on almost pure quartz sand, anything up to 15 kilometres deep in parts. Now, this sand is extremely deficient in essential plant nutrients, especially nitrogen and phosphorus. A clue to the ability of the plants to do so well here is found in their root system. Let's go and have a look at this Banksia menziesii. Creeping just on the surface under the layer of litter, we usually find a dense mat of rootlets. Let's have a look. In Banksias, the dense mat of rootlets we see here are called proteoid roots. They're a peculiar feature of the Banksia family Proteaceae and serve to enhance nutrient uptake. Apart from the surface rootlets, there is a second part of the root system which takes the system well down into the ground. This is the taproot and the sinker roots coming off the lateral branches. Let's dig a hole and have a look at them. Well, here's the root system exposed for us to see. This is the taproot passing down here, and over here we have a fairly deep lateral coming off the taproot and moving down deep into the soil. Here's the surface root system that we met earlier, which bore that dense mat of proteoid roots, and we can see off these lateral branches a few sinker roots passing down on their way towards the water table. One of the most unusual features of Banksia woodland is the way it recovers after complete removal of the original vegetation, such as in a sand quarry or clearing for roads or houses. A number of otherwise quite rare species begin to colonise the bare areas. But by far the most important is the woolly bush, Adenanthus signorum. Like Banksias, the woolly bush has a mat of proteoid roots which enhance nutrient and water uptake in these impoverished sands. It has extremely hairy, finger-like leaves which wrap around the stem and serve to reduce water loss. In fact, it can survive the summer without losing any significant amounts of water through transpiration if necessary. The juvenile plants have long branches indicating rapid growth, but no flowers. After 5 years, the stems become more divided and shorter, and flowering commences in spring and continues right through summer. But something else appears as well, calluses on the ends of some of the leaves called extrafloral nectaries. These are located near the flowers and developing fruits. While honey-eaters are attracted to nectar in the flowers, ants and parasitic wasps are attracted to nectar on the extrafloral nectaries. Even on a windy day, the ants are busy. These insect visitors are believed to benefit the plant by removing or destroying eggs or larvae of insect pests that they meet on the plant, especially the bag caterpillar, which eats the flowers and fruits, as well as the leaves. However, much more remains to be known about this intriguing symbiotic relationship. One of the most traumatic natural events with which the Banksia woodland has to cope at irregular intervals is fire. This area was burned by the Bushfires Board in mid-October as part of its program to reduce the amount of fuel around Jandakot Airport. It's 2 months now since the fire occurred, and there's been almost no rain over that time. But already we can see a tremendous amount of regeneration of the plants has occurred. Take, for example, the she-oak, Casuarina fraseriana, which is developing a tremendous number of epicormic shoots rising from hidden buds underneath the thick bark which survived the fire. And beneath me we have Sterlingia latifolia, which is regenerating vigorously by many stems arising from its underground rootstock which survived the fire. And behind me we have the famous blackboy, Xanthorrhoea priceyi, with its needle-like leaves arising from the apex. Now this apex is actually hidden deep inside the plant and has been protected by these persistent leaf bases which surrounded the apex and protected it from the full heat of the fire. And over here we have one of the native legumes which was killed right down to the ground level, and at the ground level we find in fact new shoots are arising from just underneath the soil. And over here we have Banksia attenuata, which is recovering from the fire by scores of epicormic shoots arising at many points along the old stem that survived the fire. And finally 1 or 2 of these will take over as the main branches of the plant in years to come. Looking at the ground flora, we see a tremendous number of species which look as though they're actually seedlings, but in fact that's not true because there's been no rain and hence no germination has occurred. In fact, these too are recovering from various underground parts which have enabled them to recover very much quicker than if they'd come from seedlings. Take, for example, this wire rush here, which, when we dig it up, we find that it has these thick roots on underground stems, and the very many apices that are giving rise to these new shoots were actually protected by the fire because they were actually underground at the time. And over here we have some other little plants, astrolamas and bossias, and other plants which have all recovered via their underground roots. And over here we have one of the native irises, Papisonia occidentalis, which, when we dig it up, we find that it has a horizontal rhizome and many sheathing leaf bases which protected the delicate apices from the heat of the fire. And finally, over here we have the well-known firewood Banksia, Banksia menziesii. And this is a small plant, and we can see that the new shoots are arising from a swollen base here, which is called a lignituber. And this is a source of hidden buds which emerge after the fire. The Banksia woodland was completely blackened by the fire 2 months ago. But already we can see that this Zamia palm has recovered its full complement of fronds, and this was made possible by the presence of its apex being some 10 centimetres underneath the soil, which was protected from the heat of the fire. And this enabled the fronds to rise above the ground even in that short time. Now, Zamias exist as either male or female plants, and we can tell that this one is a female because beside it are a number of much smaller plants which must have arisen from seed dropped from this mother plant some years before. Most trees in Banksia woodland have wind-dispersed seed. Large quantities of mature seed are also released following the fire. This is the candlestick Banksia, which was scorched by fire while carrying mature cones. The branchlets supporting the cones were killed, which dried them out, causing the follicles to open. The two winged seeds are not dispersed immediately. They are held in place by a central plate, which gradually levers the seeds out of the follicle, protecting them from the elements before they are dispersed. This area was control burnt by the bushfires war just over 2 years ago, and we can see now quite considerable regeneration of the resprout has occurred. Take, for example, this Adenanthus obovata with its very strong new shoots coming from its lignituber, and we see that the epicormic shoots in the Banksia menziesii are now well developed, and those in the she oak, Tegerina fraserana, too have made substantial growth in that 2-year period. But that's not the entire story, because in fact quite a few species are actually killed by the fire. Among the smaller plants we have quite a lot of species which must recover only from seed. So there are the two major types of recovery from fire, either resprouting or from seedlings. Now, the problem with seedlings is that they must grow sufficiently to be able to flower and set seed again before the next fire. So this means that there's a certain limit to fire frequency in the Banksia woodland if it's going to be maintained. The other problem these days is with weeds. When the bush is burnt, the area is opened up, the nutrient availability is increased, and this increases the accessibility to the establishment of weeds. And so this is another problem that the bushland has to cope with. In the absence of additional fires, invasion by weeds, or clearing for development, the Banksia woodland will gradually return to equilibrium. The woolly bushes will disappear until the next disturbance, and the resprouters will again dominate, especially the Banksias. In this program, I've tried to show the intricate and varied relationships that exist between the organisms in the often harsh environment of the Perth coastal plain. They have evolved over millions of years, and yet if their great interest and value to the people of Perth is not recognised, they could be lost in my lifetime. Programs such as this are no substitute for the real thing. Conservation begins with getting out into the bush and beginning to appreciate your natural environment.